That night Dylan slowed the song, lifted his head, and the hall of 2,000 people went so silent that as the last guitar string trembled, ears rang in the emptiness. Philadelphia. March 1987. The Tower Theater. A venue that had seen decades of performances, thousands of artists, countless nights of music and applause and the predictable rhythms of entertainment. Bob Dylan was on stage. 61 years old. Gray curls. Worn face. Dark shirt. Acoustic guitar slung across his body. He'd been touring for 25 years straight. No breaks. No explanations. Just town after town, stage after stage, the same songs rearranged, deconstructed, rebuilt, as if he was searching for something inside the melodies that kept eluding him. The set list that night was typical. Tangled Up in Blue. Simple Twist of Fate. Shelter from the Storm. Songs the audience knew by heart. Songs they'd heard 100 times on records, on radio, in their own heads during lonely drives and difficult years. Dylan didn't talk much between songs. He never did. A nod. A brief "thank you." Then back to the guitar. Back to the work. He was 3 songs into the second set when he started playing Girl from the North Country. The audience settled in. They knew this one. An old song. From 1963. Before the electric controversy. Before the motorcycle accident. Before everything that made Bob Dylan into Bob Dylan, the burden, the symbol, the voice of a generation he never asked to represent. The song started normally. Gentle finger-picking. That weathered voice carrying the familiar melody about a girl from long ago, asking someone to remember her, to see if her hair still hangs long, if she still remembers the promises made. Standard arrangement. Standard tempo. The audience swayed slightly. Some closed their eyes. This was comfort. This was nostalgia. This was what they came for. And then, in the third verse, Dylan slowed down. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just a subtle pulling back of tempo, like someone walking who suddenly decides to stop and look around. His fingers on the guitar strings moved slower. The spaces between notes grew wider. The song that had been moving forward began to hang in the air, suspended. The audience felt it immediately. That collective sense that something had shifted. People who'd been swaying stopped. Eyes that had been closed opened. The comfortable predictability of the performance cracked open. Dylan lifted his head. He'd been looking down at his guitar the whole song, the way he usually did, head bent, face hidden, retreating into the music. But now his head came up slowly, deliberately. His eyes moved across the audience. Not performing. Not engaging. Just looking. Witnessing. The hall went completely silent. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. 2,000 people held their breath. The song had stopped, not ended, but stopped, frozen in the third verse like someone had pressed pause on time itself. Dylan's hands rested on the guitar strings but didn't move. The last note hung in the air, vibrating, fading, until even that disappeared and there was only silence. Dylan looked toward the left side of the hall. Row G, seat 14. There sat a woman in her 60s. Gray hair pulled back. Simple dress. Weathered hands folded in her lap. She wasn't crying. Wasn't moving. Just sitting very still, looking back at Dylan with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what was happening. Her name was Margaret Sullivan. Dylan had never met her. Would never meet her. But he'd been told about her 3 hours before the concert. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened backstage that afternoon. Dylan had arrived at the Tower Theater at 4 p.m. for soundcheck. This was routine. Check the acoustics. Test the monitors. Make sure everything worked. He didn't socialize with venue staff. Didn't do meet and greets. Just the work. His tour manager, a man named Victor Maymudes who'd been with Dylan since the early days, had knocked on the dressing room door. "Bob, there's someone here. Says she needs to talk to you." "No," Dylan said, tuning his guitar. You know I don't do that. I know. But she says it's about Danny Sullivan. Dylan's hands stopped moving on the guitar strings. Danny Sullivan. A name he hadn't heard in 40 years. A name from Hibbing, Minnesota. From high school. From before everything. What about him? Dylan asked quietly. She says she's his sister. Says Danny died last week. Says there's something you need to know. Dylan put down the guitar. Send her in. Margaret Sullivan entered the dressing room carrying nothing but a small envelope. She was nervous. You could see it in the way she held herself, the way her hands trembled slightly. She'd clearly been crying recently. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Mr. Dylan, she started. Just Bob, he interrupted gently. Bob. I'm Margaret. Danny Sullivan's sister. I don't know if you remember him. I remember Danny, Dylan said. And he did. Perfectly. Danny Sullivan had been the kid in his English class in Hibbing High School who lent him a book of Woody Guthrie poems in 1956. The first time Dylan, then still Robert Zimmerman, had encountered Guthrie's words. The spark that lit everything. Danny died Tuesday, Margaret said. Cancer. He'd been fighting it for 2 years. I'm sorry. He made me promise something. Margaret held out the envelope with shaking hands. He made me promise that if you ever came to Philadelphia, I would find you and give you this. He's been carrying it since 1956. 31 years. Dylan took the envelope. Old paper. Yellowed. His name written on the front in faded pencil. Robert Zimmerman / Bob Dylan. He never mailed it. Margaret continued. He said he was waiting until he knew what to say. But he ran out of time. So he made me promise to hand it to you. To tell you that the book mattered. That what you became mattered. That he was proud to have been there at the beginning, even if you don't remember. Dylan opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded. He opened it. The handwriting was shaky, the handwriting of someone very sick, writing with enormous effort. Bob. You probably don't remember me. That's okay. I was just some kid who lent you a book. But I wanted you to know that I've spent 31 years watching you become what you became. And I wanted to tell you something. You spent your whole life running. From Minnesota. From your name. From the labels people put on you. From the expectation that you speak for everyone. I understand why. The weight must be unbearable. But I want you to know, the gift wasn't the songs. The gift was the permission. You showed all of us, everyone who felt trapped in small towns, in small lives, in identities we didn't choose, that it was okay to leave. To change. To refuse to be what others needed you to be. The girl from the North Country? She's all of us. Everyone you left behind. Everyone who stayed. And we're okay. You don't owe us anything. You never did. Thank you for the journey. I'm glad I got to see part of it. Danny Sullivan. Dylan read the letter 3 times. Margaret stood quietly, waiting. Thank you, Dylan finally said, his voice rough. For bringing this. There's one more thing, Margaret said. Danny asked me to tell you something. He said, tell Bob that the girl is still here. Her hair doesn't hang long anymore. But she remembers. Dylan looked at her. You? Margaret nodded, tears finally spilling over. I'm the girl from the North Country. The one you wrote about. Danny told me years ago. Said you'd been sweet on me in high school but were too shy to say anything. Said the song was for me but you'd never admit it. I was 16. Dylan said quietly. I know. So was I. And Danny spent 31 years carrying that letter and that secret because he wanted you to know, we're still here. We're still proud of you. And you don't have to carry us anymore. She left the dressing room. Dylan sat alone with the letter for an hour. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. That night on stage during Girl from the North Country. Dylan reached the third verse. The verse about asking someone to see if her hair still hangs long. The verse about promises. And something broke open inside him. 31 years of running. 31 years of refusing to look back. 31 years of carrying the weight of being Bob Dylan, instead of Robert Zimmerman from Hibbing. Danny Sullivan was dead. The boy who'd handed him the Woody Guthrie book, the moment that started everything, was gone. And with him went the last living connection to the person Dylan had been before the fame, before the burden, before the world decided who he was supposed to be. So Dylan slowed the song down. He lifted his head and looked at Margaret Sullivan sitting in row G, seat 14. The girl from the North Country. Still here. Still remembering. And he stopped playing entirely. The silence in the Tower Theatre was absolute. You could hear the building itself breathe. You could hear 2,000 hearts beating in unison. You could hear the weight of time settling into every corner of the room. Dylan spoke. Just 5 words. Quiet. Almost a whisper. But the microphone carried them through the hall. Her hair doesn't hang long. The audience didn't understand. How could they? This was between Dylan and a woman in row G and a dead man who'd carried a letter for 3 decades. Margaret Sullivan stood up slowly. Not dramatically. Just rising from her seat the way someone does when they've been sitting too long. Her gray hair was visible even in the dim auditorium light. Dylan nodded to her. Once. A small acknowledgement across the darkness and the years and the distance between who they'd been and who they'd become. Then he started playing again. But the song was different now. Slower. Weighted. Every note carrying something that hadn't been there before. He wasn't performing anymore. He was remembering. He was saying goodbye. He was releasing something he'd been holding for 31 years. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. When the song ended, there was no applause. Not at first. The audience sat in stunned silence, sensing they'd witnessed something that transcended performance. Something private that had happened in public. Something they didn't fully understand but felt in their bones. Then, slowly, starting from row G where Margaret Sullivan stood with tears streaming down her face, the applause began. Quiet at first. Then building. Not the explosive applause of entertainment, but the reverent applause of bearing witness. Dylan didn't acknowledge it. He moved directly into the next song. No pause. No explanation. The show continued as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that theater knew something had changed. After the concert, Dylan's tour manager found Margaret Sullivan in the lobby. Bob asked me to give you this. It was the letter. Danny's letter. Dylan had written something on the back. Margaret. Danny was right. The gift was permission. Thank you for letting me leave. Thank you for staying. Your hair looks beautiful. B. Margaret kept that letter until she died in 2003. It's now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, displayed next to the original typed lyrics of Girl from the North Country. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Dylan never played that song the same way again. Sometimes he'd slow it down in the third verse. Sometimes he'd stop entirely and let silence fill the hall. Sometimes he'd look out into the audience as if searching for someone. People who were at the Tower Theatre that night in March 1987 still talk about it. They can't quite explain what happened. Just that Bob Dylan, the man who spent 50 years running from expectations, from labels, from the burden of being a symbol, stopped running for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He looked back. He remembered. He let himself be Robert Zimmerman from Hibbing one more time. And then he let it go. The tour continued. 500 more cities. 10,000 more songs. Dylan kept moving forward, always forward, never explaining, never stopping. But he carried Danny's letter in his guitar case for the rest of his life. In 2016, when Dylan won the Nobel Prize and didn't show up to accept it, a journalist asked why he seemed uncomfortable with recognition. Dylan's response was brief. The people who mattered already know. Margaret Sullivan watched the ceremony from her nursing home in Philadelphia. She smiled. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The girl from the North Country stayed. The boy who became Bob Dylan left. And for 3 minutes and 40 seconds in a theater in Philadelphia, they met one more time in the only place they could, inside a song that had always belonged to them both. Dylan never explained what happened that night. He never did.